Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode, Ben Vanhook joins me to discuss the impact of intersectional identities on his autistic experience and how developing autistic community has positively impacted his life. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Ben, thanks so much for joining me today here on Autism Stories.
Yes, thank you so much. I look forward to speaking with you and sharing my story. Thank you so much for allowing me to educate and inform people as to how best to support the neurodivergent community. And thank you so much for allowing me to share my story as an intersectional individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of talking about your story, where would you say it begins in the autistic community?
So I would say my story begins when I was 5 years old, and this was in 2005, as that was when I was diagnosed. However, my diagnosis was hidden from me, and I didn't really find out until I was around 16 or 17, as I was about to graduate high school, that I was autistic. I actually first heard the word autism when my college counselor used it when we were searching for colleges. And my first reaction was of shock and surprise. I was like, what is autism? Is it dangerous or scary? What does this word mean? I wasn't really a part of any IEP meetings when I was in elementary school or middle school, so I had no idea what it meant to be neurodivergent. I did know that I was treated differently educationally and socially by my peers, as I was taken into specialized smaller classroom settings in elementary school, and I also was kind of ostracized by my peers. No one really wanted to talk with me, and I didn't really know why. I also went to a private middle and high school for neurodivergent individuals, but at the time I thought those were to protect me from bullies because I was bullied a lot in public school, and I relentlessly asked my parents, can you send me to the private institution? I don't want to be bullied anymore. So I thought these privatized schools was to protect me from bullying, but in reality they were to support my neurodivergent mind. I eventually ended up going to Mercyhurst University, which had an autism program called Autism Initiative at Mercyhurst. And this experience furthered my connection with the autistic community, as for the first time, I was able to learn about my autism and I felt understood. I felt like I was in a neuro affirming space with like minded peers and staff who could actually support my needs. This really helped me because being understood and being respected, it helped me begin to respect myself and respect my own needs. And although I struggled at first with the transition from college, I ended up thriving in this program. And I was actually able to make quite a few friends in college because the autism program really helped me grow socially as well as academically and through and with like self-advocacy skills. As part of this autism program, we as students went on vocational exposure trips where the staff members of this program would take students to DC and New York City to advocate for autism reform with lawmakers, politicians, and different neuroaffirming organizations. We talked to Autism Speaks, we talked to Autism Society. We also talked to organizations like Wells Fargo, PricewaterhouseCoopers, MITRE, amongst many others who were supporting neurodiverse initiatives. But throughout these programs, not only did we learn skills necessary for advocacy, but we also learned so many soft skills. Like we learned how to network with other people. We learned budgeting. We learned interpersonal communication. We also learned how to show up on time to different meetings. We learned appropriate dress wear for these meetings. And we learned how to articulate our needs and how to self-advocate for ourselves during these different trips. I was actually one of the only people on these trips who really enjoyed going from meeting to meeting. I was one of the only people who actually had the spoons to handle 5 back-to-back meetings with different employers and different influential figures because I was just like, this is my jam. I was just so excited to talk about reform and what we can do to support our community. And I remember a conversation I had with a friend on one of these trips in which she told me these meetings are boring and just asked me if I felt the same. And I had to tell her that these were actually the most exciting experiences I've had, because these are the rooms and meetings in which things get done. These are really the discussions with these employers that drive change. And these are the stories that we tell employers that can really inspire action and inspire these organizations to become more neuro inclusive. So that conversation and the skills I had learned throughout my vocational trips with the autism program carried with me throughout college and even beyond. I ended up graduating in 2021 with a bachelor's with honors in political science and psychology. However, part of me was just like, now what do I do? I'm graduated. What's next? I knew I wanted to work in disability and disability advocacy, but I didn't know how to get my foot in the door. I eventually was accepted into a Master's of Public Policy program at George Mason University, but I realized I needed to find a way to make money, to pay rent and to pay for food, as I was living in an apartment for the first time in my life. So I started working a part-time job at the college in which I was learning coach. So I was supporting undergraduates in the autism program at George Mason through like setting goals academically and being able to meet those goals, coming up with strategies to support them academically. That was kind of my role. But my life kind of took a change when I broke my computer last February. The computer itself was around $1,000, and my father told me he'd pay for the computer, but I would have to pay him the money back eventually. And I realized in 2022, given a shrinking jobs market and that I was competing, against different COVID classes. I was competing against the classes of 2019, 2020, and 2021 to get a job. So it wasn't easy to find this full-time job. And I realized my part-time job wasn't really going to help me pay back the $1,000. So I started up a LinkedIn account for the sole purpose of finding a job and making connections and getting my foot in the door. I started following and connecting with fellow autistics and other neurodivergent content creators, and I just reached out asking, can I have an opportunity in public speaking? Can I have an opportunity to share my story? And like, I was 23 years old. I didn't have any reputation and nobody knew who I was. I wasn't really expecting much, but I at least wanted to try and do what I could to get myself into a position, where I could get different opportunities to share my story and to connect. All I wanted, at that time was to show that I could do something, to show what I could bring to an initiative or a project. And eventually a few opportunities did pop up. Someone I've been good friends with for about a year now, his name's Eric Enlick, reached out to me asking if I wanted to be a part of a student panel for a film called Autism Goes to College, which I accepted. And after that, during that panel, it was a really good experience because I got to learn how these panels were run. I was able to look at the questions being asked and what kind of information people wanted to know about autism. And I was able to share my story with the world for the first time. That was kind of where my first bits of advocacy work kind of started. And from this event, like, different opportunities bred different opportunities. And I was able to create different posts on LinkedIn. And over time, people started like resonating with my message. People began seeing my message. And the first time I really thought that I could actually make a career on LinkedIn through disability advocacy was kind of in the spring of 2022, when one of my posts went international. It was shared around Australia. And the post itself was me talking about the differences between acceptance and appreciation and how we can get to appreciation. So I woke up one morning and I was shocked to see that post like floating around halfway around the world. The person who shared it, I eventually reached out to, and we eventually became good friends. And she actually asked me to give my first ever presentation in Melbourne, Australia in 2022. And that was the first time I really had international exposure in the autism field. Through these opportunities, I not only made great professional connections in the advocacy space, but I've also made some really close friends, and I've developed some really close partnerships and alliances with different people in the community. And not only did that help me professionally, but it also helped me personally. It helped my physical and psychological well-being, because I actually felt like I felt validated and I felt appreciated for just being me and for sharing my story. I didn't feel scared to share anything at all because I felt like I was in a neuroaffirming space through these communities on LinkedIn, and I felt like I would be supported through the good times and bad times. Once I entered this community, and once I was accepted with open arms in this community, I really hadn't looked back. So this community has really meant the world to me.
I love hearing about you learning about your autism and advocating. And I know disclosing about one's autism can bring up some negative emotions, especially based on the way people might respond. So, what would be some important ways for allies to respond when you, myself, or anyone else discloses about our autism?
Yeah, I really love this question because it's a really important one, and it's one that a lot of people in the community really struggle to understand. Like, it's hard to disclose because it's really personal and it can lead to different stigmas and biases. But for me personally, I haven't really had too much problem opening up, as to me, disclosure is a way to communicate my needs. My thoughts going into different projects and before disclosing is that one can't really support what one doesn't know. So if I don't disclose what I need or that I'm autistic, it can be really hard for people to understand what I need, why I need it, and how they best can provide supports for me in those areas. Usually disclosing is a way to help me address my needs with people who maybe haven't worked with me or don't really know that I'm autistic. One of the most important things allies can do is to listen to us without judgment and trust that we are telling the truth when we say we are disabled or we are autistic or neurodivergent. Some things I've heard in the past that were unhelpful were people saying, you don't look disabled, or how disabled are you? And basically people getting us to justify or qualify our disability. I think those things really add on to the stress because we have to find a way to prove that we're disabled enough to qualify as disabled in some people's minds. So my piece of advice is to take us at face value. When we disclose, we are telling people some of the most personal, hidden aspects of our lives. And we are trusting you that with the most sensitive information, some of the most sensitive information. And many people who disclose only disclose when they've exhausted all other options and all other means of communication. So I think it's important to be respectful and to listen to these people, because many times disclosure is not really a free choice, but out of necessity. And some other ways that allies can respond are through asserting their support for neurodivergence and telling them that they're going to be supportive no matter who they are and what they are, and no matter what they need, they're going to be there for them and they're going to provide the support as best they can. Lastly, I want to mention that one thing that I've struggled with, or one thing that really annoys me, is when people treat me as if I'm a child, if I'm neurodivergent, or if I disclose my autism. I think that's something that's really frustrating because as soon as some people hear that I'm autistic, their whole demeanor towards me changes. They feel like they have to kind of baby me through different situations, and they feel like they might have to simplify complex bits of information, despite the fact that I graduated with honors in political science and psychology. So I think it's important to treat neurodivergence as you would any other person. And it's important to be respectful and be able to listen to us and our needs.
And talking more about disclosure, you are the community support coordinator for the Organization for Autism Research. And one of your responsibilities is an in house self advocacy resource. So, what are some important things for someone to think about when deciding to disclose their autism, whether it's to family, friends, at the workplace, or maybe other situations?
Yes, so some important considerations might be the situation in which you're disclosing in. Is it a situation where you could derive a benefit from disclosing, such as during an interview or before the interview, when there's an opportunity to maybe ask for accommodations, like the questions ahead of time, or putting the questions in writing, or being able to asking the interviewer to break down complex questions. So I think if there is an opportunity to derive benefit from disclosing, then one should definitely consider it. I also think it depends on the people you're disclosing to. Is it someone you trust, or is it someone who might not be someone you would trust with this sensitive information? Is it a close family or relative, or is it a stranger? And is it someone you trust will keep this information private and secret so nobody else will have access to your files or that bit of information? So I think the person you're disclosing to, or the person who you might be disclosing to, is really important to consider. I also think it's important to ask yourselves, have you yourself accepted your autism? Because I think it's hard to get others to accept you if you haven't really accepted who you are yet. A third consideration point would be, have you yourself accepted who you are?
Yeah, definitely. How can you ask for something from someone else if you don't know what you need yourself?
For sure.
Yeah. So you're also the community director for the Autistic Advantage podcast, which I believe just launched not that long ago. So I've been doing podcasting for several years now, and I've never heard of a community director for a podcast. Therefore, I'm wondering what the heck do you do in this role as the community director?
Yes, so the Autistic Advantage podcast is great because we have four people who are neurodivergent and who are working in their areas of specialty. So we have someone who specializes in video editing. So he's our video editor. We have a host, Olivia Fox Cabane, and she's someone who has experience interviewing people and a lot of public speaking experience, and that's her expertise. So she's the host and the person who's interviewing people each episode. And we have someone who's really talented in social media and creating canvas and different graphics. So she's our social media designer and promoter. And my role is the community director. And for me, my position consists of a lot of outreach and a lot of scheduling. So I'm responsible for doing the initial outreach to the people we end up having on our show, providing them information about the show, providing them like the materials ahead of time, and scheduling the initial meeting with Olivia. So I'm the scheduler and I'm basically the coordinator and the outreach person, because those are some things that I'm really strong in.
Now, learning that you're a community support coordinator and community director for two different roles makes me think about the word that both of those roles have in common, and that's community. What's the role of community in your life, particularly thinking about your autistic identity?
Yeah, I really love that question as well. Community to me is super important, especially as it relates to autism, because for much of my life, I hadn't really been accepted for who I was as an autistic individual. I was oftentimes called weird or creepy or antisocial by my peers, and a lot of people didn't really want to interact with me. My parents also didn't really understand my autism and couldn't really understand my experiences. When I brought up my concerns to them, they called me over dramatic. They thought that I was making things up, or they thought I was making a mountain out of a molehill. When I tried to advocate for myself in the past, I was oftentimes dismissed, or I was called rude or disrespectful. I was also not really allowed to say no to people. I wasn't allowed to reject different invites. I wasn't really allowed to say no to my parents. So if there were cases when I did say no, I was either punished, or I was called disobedient or selfish, or something bad happened to me. I was also previously not really allowed to set boundaries, or else I was called self-centered, and my parents would just get really angry. There was a time recently where my mother sent me like 20 different angry texts saying I forgot to do something, and that really overwhelmed me. It was massively overstepping my boundaries, and it caused me to shut down for a whole week because it was so overwhelming and I didn't really know how to respond. So it was, in the past, it had been really difficult to find that sense of community and to find a support network or a support system. And it was really difficult to find people who truly understood me. Since joining LinkedIn about a year ago, I feel like I've become a part of an autistic community that is focused on advocacy, that's focused on support and validation. And being a part of this community, even though it's on LinkedIn as opposed to like in person, has drastically changed my life because for the first time ever, I truly feel validated. I truly feel supported, loved, appreciated. I feel like people care about me and I feel respected just for being me and existing as an autistic person. And that really means a lot to me. I also feel like for the first time ever, I have a secure attachment to a community and I feel a sense of belonging to this community. And the sense of belonging is really important to me because I feel like it's given my life meaning. I feel like I truly can achieve my goals. I feel like I have this large army of self advocates behind me. And I feel like I'm also just as willing to support others in their goals in the advocacy field and the advocacy community as they are for me. So I feel like that mutual respect and mutual support is there. I also feel like I've been able to find my friends and find my tribe through LinkedIn because we're able to bond over shared experiences, shared traumas, and also shared interests. Because a lot of us are really interested in advocacy, and a lot of us come from different parts of the globe. Like, you have people from Kenya, you have people from the United States, from Canada, from England, you have people from Germany, just all coming together to support neurodivergent individuals. So it's been a really good experience being able to learn and bond over shared experiences, even with people who are like thousands of miles away. I also I feel indebted to the autistic community for all the support and love they've shown me over the past years and for the friendships and connections I've been able to form. And I feel being able to find my friends and find my tribe through LinkedIn has really helped me when it comes to my self efficacy and my self belief and self confidence. And most importantly, it's helped me with my self esteem. It's helped me feel like, I am worthy and I am worth being respected. So I feel finding my community on LinkedIn has really worked wonders for me.
Now, our autistic identity is one of our identities, and I think about how this identity interacts with other identities that we have. And, I think about intersectionality, which is absolutely essential to the quality of our lives as autistics. What are the identities beyond your autistic identity you identify with, and in what ways do you see them most impacting your autism?
Yeah, so I'm an autistic Asian American Jewish adoptee. And this is something that it makes me unique. It makes me feel special and I'm part of a few different select communities. But it can also be really overwhelming and exhausting because I feel, especially in this day and age, that I'm constantly fighting for my right to coexist peacefully as a human being. I feel like when one identity isn't attacked, another is. So I kind of feel like a boxer that's constantly being beaten down. If one identity isn't punched down, another is, and having to just find the strength to get back up each day. And this had like especially affected me like in the past few years when COVID hit American shores. There was a lot of hate crimes against Asian American individuals. Hate crimes skyrocketed, especially in like California and in New York City. We were apparently blamed for COVID. But then, especially like recently, there's been a rise in anti Semitism. There's been anti Semitic related shootings, vandalisms, especially like after Kanye West said a lot of really derogatory things towards the Asian American, the Jewish community. So I feel it's like an ongoing battle, but it's also something that makes me unique and makes me stand out for better or worse. Some ways it has impacted me, especially when I was a child, was in school. In elementary school, I was racially abused, bullied, harassed, and I was discriminated against for being Asian American and one of the only Asian Americans in my school. I would often come home and my parents about the bullying, but their response would be to basically blame me for the incidents. They would respond with things like, "What did you do to provoke the bullies?" Or they would be like your misperceiving of the situation, your misunderstanding of the situation, or they'd go with the you're being over dramatic or they were only joking, excuses, even though jokes typically don't end in tears. They would also use the classic sticks and stones will break my bones kind of rhyme. And I feel this gaslighting was really harmful. And to this day, I still feel the effects of that because I often question my emotions and whether I have the right to feel these different emotions and these different feelings over incidences and over certain things going on in the world. I'm also adopted, and I think being adopted and being autistic gives you a different experience and gives you a unique experience that non-adopted autistics and people who weren't really autistic but also adopted don't really experience. My story really begins in a northeastern city in Harbin, China, and it starts in a train station in Harbin. I was abandoned in this train station by my biological mother. It was, I think, mid-July. After abandonment, I was found and I was fostered and sent to an orphanage in the city. I don't really have a great recollection of that time because I was still really young, but eventually I was adopted and brought to the United States where I was living with a white family and have been living with a white family for like 20 years now. I've always told people when talking about adoption adoption is one of the only traumas in which people expect the victim to be grateful. After all, adoption can, give children opportunities they otherwise wouldn't have had back at home. They can also give potential victims of child labor, child exploitation a better and more meaningful life than they otherwise would have had. But it can also be really traumatic. And it's hard to discuss traumas of autism and being adopted because any attempt to discuss these traumas would most likely be met with like people saying how grateful I should be for being adopted, or people would say things could have been much worse. And it can oftentimes feel very invalidating, making it really difficult to discuss these different experiences. I often break these traumas into two separate traumas when it comes to adoption. The first being the initial abandonment from my caregiver. I didn't really realize at the time how impactful this initial separation would be. To this day, I've always been afraid of forming friendships because I was afraid of being abandoned. I was afraid of that friendship ending or people moving on. And I feel a lot of that has to do with my initial separation from my caregiver because of the way I was abandoned and not really having that biological connection to her. I also feel afraid of being forgotten, kind of like I was by my initial caregivers. So that initial separation is one trauma that accompanies adoption. The second trauma comes with having to assimilate to a totally different culture. An Asian American born in China has to learn a new language, they have to learn a new culture, a new way of life and living, and they also have to learn how to grow up in a majority white area in which discrimination and racism were, at least to me, they were the norms. So it was these traumas like combined with my autism and my neurodiversity really had an impact on my life and on my self-perception of myself and on my sense of security when it comes to just existing as an Asian American, Jewish neurodivergent without being afraid of being attacked or being abused or people shouting racist things at me. So I feel it definitely gives me a different experience, but it's also had some positives. Like I feel like these intersections make me a lot more compassionate towards other people. I feel having been bullied and abused my whole life has really helped me open up as a person, and it's really helped me empathize with other people's situations in a way I may not have had I not been exposed to these different traumas myself. I feel, well, there are some difficulties in my intersections, and through my experiences, it's helped me become a better person, and it's helped me become a more empathetic and compassionate person.
And beyond this interview, how can our listeners learn more about you, Ben, and maybe also the Autistic Advantage podcast?
Yeah, so I'm usually on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn handle is Ben Vanhook, Ben space VANHOOK. And my picture is me, an Asian American in a kind of tannish suit. I'm also on Facebook at the same name. The Autistic Advantage podcast can be found on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify under the name The Autistic Advantage Podcast. And it can also be found on LinkedIn under the same name.
Well, I've been following you on LinkedIn, Ben, and I've really enjoyed reading your posts. So definitely encourage people to check you out on LinkedIn, and really love our conversation today. Thanks so much for making time to talk with me today, Ben.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much to Ben for the conversation. To learn more about Ben, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. At Autism Personal Coach, we provide customized coaching for autistics to help improve the quality of our lives. All of our coaches are either autistic or autistic selected for their commitment for trauma informed and neurodiversity affirming strategies. They deeply understand burnout, sensory needs, executive functioning, and the importance of special interests. If you're interested in learning more about our coaching, please visit autismpersonalcoach.com for more information. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories, and if you did, if you could tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable and educational experience as you when listening to Autism Stories, it'd be very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.